In this trending story, we're going to talk about the new aviation agreement that was just announced coming out of ICAO meetings in Montreal. This is actually a really complicated topic, as we'll get into, in terms of the question of is this a good thing or a bad thing for making progress on climate change? On the one hand, obviously, any agreement to cut emissions, potentially a good thing. But in this case, we're actually combining a whole bunch of pieces in terms of a climate change chessboard. And all of those pieces are going to have to fit together. And so like so many other things in this space, when you say, is this good or is this bad? Well, it depends. And it depends on a lot of things that are going to happen in the future that we really can't predict today. So, but we can identify what those things are in terms of the variables that we're going to have to keep an eye out for on this variable. Now let me just jump over to sort of a cheat sheet in terms of discussing this issue, and then at the end I'll also show you how you can further explore the issue in the climate web if you want to do that. So, this is an agreement that has been under discussion for years. There's been a lot of frustration in the climate negotiations that the maritime sector and the aviation sector were left out of the agreements, and a whole series of reasons for that. But in any case, they weren't part of the Paris Agreement. They had been at one point and then disappeared from the text. And up to this point, there has been no formal target or emissions reduction agreement for the aviation sector. And it's important because the sector right now is somewhere around 2% of global emissions, but rising rapidly. And so in a situation where you have rapidly rising aviation sector emissions and potentially falling emissions from other sectors, you had some crazy scenarios where aviation eventually was 50% of global emissions. And so you can see why this issue sort of had to be addressed and why there's been so much focus on it in terms of getting an international agreement. Now, is technology ignored in this? Well, no. The text of the resolution basically says that the issue is that technology isn't moving fast enough to be able to ensure climate neutrality post-2020 for the aviation sector, i.e. Emissions that on net don't grow after 2020. And so yes, jet planes are getting more energy efficient all the time, but by no means are they getting efficient fast enough to overcome the increase in miles being flown in the aviation sector. So the agreement basically says, look, we're not going to be able to make as much progress as we need to make, specifically with technology and with biofuels, which is a whole other complicated topic. And so in the meantime, we'll use offsets. Now, a key thing here is what's the price of the offsets? And as it turns out, based on some of the analysis that Bloomberg has done, this agreement seems to assume offsets somewhere between $2 and $6 a ton. Now, that's a pretty low price for offsets, at least certainly looking into the future, and would seem to potentially undercut the pressure for technology advancement. If you have a choice between technology advancement, which could be pretty intensive, pretty expensive to accomplish, versus just buying an offset for $2 to $6, you could envision decisions being made more in favor of offsets, which does raise at some point a problem. If you get to a certain point and then you have to say, well, now we need to start reducing absolute emissions, and you haven't constrained those emissions for the last 10, 15, 20 years, you could end up in a pretty difficult place. And so that's one of the key issues with this agreement and counting on offsets going forward. Now, could offsets work? Well, sure. That's always been the case. Offsets could work. There is work suggesting that there are enough quality offsets out there, etc. But will they? This has always been the Achilles heel of market mechanisms involving offsets, that even though offsets certainly could work very well, They tend not to, because we end up focusing on trying to get the price down, or we are not careful enough about designing the program in terms of ensuring the environmental integrity of the offsets, which has been a huge problem in many of the offset programs. And so this whole aviation agreement basically just sort of assumes that the offsets will be good and that this system will work as intended. And that's a pretty big assumption. And I'll point you to some more information on that in just a second. Now, one of the big issues to be aware of here is sort of the moral hazard problem, because not only do you have the aviation industry interested in finding an agreement, you also have a lot of environmental groups who are looking at this now as a way of potentially funding a number of environmental causes, and the one that's gotten the most attention is forestry, and the idea that a lot of the offsets that are going to be purchased will come from forest conservation projects, in particular so-called RED or RED Plus projects. And so with the prospect of billions and billions of dollars being spent every year on offsets, you have a real incentive for people who want to go out and do those offset projects to be in favor of this kind of an idea. So there is a lot of moral hazard here that one has to really pay attention to in designing this agreement going forward. So that's a very quick review of why this is tricky. You've got the issue of voluntary versus mandatory. You have the issue of technology versus market mechanism. You have the issue of the quality of the market mechanism in terms of carbon offsets. And all of these are actually very big issues. And you could easily envision a situation where 10, 15 years from now, you look back and say, this was a big mistake. You could also envision a situation where this got things rolling, and then we had good technology breakthroughs, and everything worked just great, and it turned out to have been a good idea. Again, you can't really predict it right now, but we should really be cognizant of what some of these issues are. So first of all, in the Climate Web, you can explore under the trending and stories and topics. We've simply linked a number of different stories, and in some cases, reports that you might be interested in. But more specifically, you can also really explore the aviation sector deep dive, which goes very deep into everything involving aviation and CO2. There is a carbon offsets deep dive, which has a massive amount of information on everything related to carbon offsets. And the RED and RED Plus index entry takes you to a lot of information on the issues of RED, avoided deforestation, and avoided deforestation-based offset credits. So there's a huge amount of backup information in the Climate Web. Now, to the extent that you're looking for a particular organization of this information or some particular research or conclusions, give us a call, because we can certainly help pull together that information for you from how we've organized it in the Climate Web. And I hope this trending story has been useful.